My name is Jennifer Maddox. I am 43 years old. I am a lieutenant general in the United States Marine Corps. But to my family, none of that ever mattered. To them, I was the failure, the disappointment, the unwanted daughter who should have known her place and stayed there. I was the one they mocked, the one they banned from my own grandfather's funeral. Because in their eyes, I had brought shame to the Maddox name. I still remember the cold rain soaking through my uniform that morning as I stood outside the old stone church where they gathered. My family, my blood, the very people who raised me. I wasn't allowed inside. I wasn't wanted. I stood beneath the iron archway, hands clasped behind my back, watching through stained glass as they laughed, exchanged hugs, and whispered behind silk gloves. I wasn't invited to grieve. I wasn't allowed to say goodbye, all because I had failed them. At least that's what they told themselves. They had no idea who I really was. No idea what I had done. No idea what was coming. I heard the words as clear as day. My mother's voice carried through the open church doors. Don't let her in. She's an embarrassment. She failed at life. My father. She brings shame on this family. She can watch from the street like the failure she is. They didn't even lower their voices. My sister, always the perfect golden child, smirked. I mean, who shows up to Grandpa's funeral in a military uniform? Pathetic. Their words cut deeper than any battlefield wound I'd ever suffered. But I held my ground. I stood tall. I didn't flinch. Because I knew something they didn't. And then it happened. The sound of synchronized footsteps echoed down the cobblestone street. I didn't need to turn to know who they were. The precision, the discipline, the sheer gravity of their presence. 12 Marines dressed in full ceremonial uniform marched in formation toward the church. They halted exactly 3 paces from me. The air shifted. Guests turned. Whispers died. And then came the moment that silenced even the most venomous tongues. A 4-star general in immaculate dress blue stepped forward. He removed his hat with gloved hands and held it to his chest. And then with crisp precision he saluted me. General J. Maddox, ma'am, he said, voice steady, unwavering. We are here to honor both your grandfather's service and yours. The world seemed to freeze. The very same family who mocked me, who told me I was worthless, stood frozen on the church steps, mouth slightly parted, hands trembling. My parents, speechless. My sister, pale. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. 12 Marines and the highest-ranking officer I had ever served under stood in formation for me. Not for them. For me. In that moment, every insult they'd ever thrown at me, every door they'd slammed, every letter they never replied to it, all dissolved into the cold morning air. Because I wasn't the failure they painted me to be. I was the one who rose while they sank. I was the one who carried the Maddox name into battles they couldn't imagine, into decisions that saved lives, into sacrifices they would never understand. And they were the ones who would have to live with the weight of what they'd done. You see, my family mocked me for failing. They banned me from my own grandfather's funeral. But minutes later, 12 Marines showed up in full uniform, led by a 4-star general. And they saluted me, General J. Maddox, ma'am. My parents froze. They were speechless. And that was just the beginning. Because the real story, the one they never saw coming, was about to unfold. And I wasn't going anywhere. My name is Jennifer Maddox. But to my family, that name has never meant much. I was the invisible daughter, the wrong daughter, the one who never quite fit into the world they built for themselves, polished, perfect, all surface, no depth. From the earliest days, I can remember I was the one on the outside looking in. I can still see the way my parents looked at me across the dinner table, the slight frowns they thought I didn't notice, the way they praised my younger sister for every little thing, her hair, her smile, her piano recitals, while I sat there in silence poking at cold mashed potatoes, waiting for them to look at me, really look at me, but they never did. She was their little queen, the golden child, the one they called princess in public and darling at home. Every photograph on the mantel was of her Easter dresses, tiaras, ballet poses. My photos were few and far between. A blurred school portrait, a forgotten birthday. Even when I tried, when I brought home perfect grades, when I excelled in sports, nothing ever seemed to be enough. I still remember the time I won first place in the regional track meet. I came home clutching the medal, my heart pounding with excitement, and my father barely glanced up from his newspaper. My mother muttered something about how it wasn't ladylike to be too competitive. They weren't cruel in the way people think of cruelty. There were no raised voices, no slamming doors. Just the slow, deliberate suffocation of being unseen. The quiet removal of warmth, of pride, of love. And when my sister decided she wanted to be a fashion designer, they poured money into her dream, without hesitation, classes, trips to Paris, an entire studio built in the basement. When I announced I wanted to join the military, they didn't laugh. That would have been too obvious. They simply smiled politely, changed the subject, and never spoke of it again. I remember one dinner burned into my memory like a scar when I was 17. We sat in stiff chairs around the oak dining table. The china was pristine. The air smelled of rosemary and expensive wine. My father asked my sister about her upcoming art showcase. My mother complimented the dress she was wearing. No one asked me anything. I sat there trying to swallow both my food and the lump in my throat. The only sound I made that evening was the soft clink of my fork against the plate. That was the night I decided I would leave. Not because I wanted to prove them wrong, but because I knew deep down I would never be enough for them. Not on their terms. I chose the Marines because I wanted to build a life on my own terms. I wanted to be measured by my actions, not by the shape of my hair or the cut of my dress. I wanted to matter. But even when I graduated boot camp, top of my class, they didn't come. Even when I earned my first promotion, I sent them a letter. They never replied. I mailed postcards from every corner of the world. I called on birthdays. I sent gifts at Christmas. Silence met me every time. Some wounds don't bleed on the outside. Some wounds look like empty mailboxes and unanswered calls. So I kept going. I became stronger, harder. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. That's what they made me. And even now, standing outside my grandfather's funeral in full uniform, I can still feel that 17-year-old girl inside me, sitting at that dinner table unseen, unheard. But this time, I'm not invisible. Not anymore. I left home the morning after my 18th birthday. No big fight, no dramatic exit, just me, a duffel bag, and the quiet understanding that I was leaving behind everything I had ever known and everything that had never truly seen me. I joined the Marines because I needed to become someone I could respect, someone who didn't wait for validation that would never come. The recruiter's office smelled like stale coffee and dust, but when I signed my name on that dotted line for the first time in my life, I felt awake. Boot camp was brutal. The days were endless. My hands, once soft and small, blistered and bled until the skin hardened into calluses. I pushed my body past every limit it had ever known. I was smaller than most of them, slower at first. But I was determined, stubborn, and no one was going to break me. I graduated in the top 5 of my class. I still remember standing at attention wearing my first uniform, the sun scorching my face, the weight of the medal they pinned to my chest. I was shaking, not from fear, but from pride. I sent them a photo that day, my parents, my sister. A crisp picture of me in uniform, holding the certificate, the medal gleaming. I wrote a simple note, made it through. Hope you're well. I never got a reply. The years that followed were a blur of deployments, promotions, and paperwork. I served in Afghanistan, then Iraq, then back home for training, then overseas again. Each time I rose in rank, I sent them something: postcards from dusty airfields, holiday cards, sometimes just a small note. Thinking of you. Silence. I still bought them gifts every Christmas, always addressed to the house where I grew up. Never a word back. Never a thank you. One year I sent my mother a silk scarf from Kyoto. Another time I mailed my father a rare pocket watch from Germany. Each time I pictured them opening the box, looking at each other, and saying nothing. I wondered if they even remembered my birthday. I still have every medal, every commendation, lined up in an old wooden box. My hands, those same hands, are rough now. The nails short and cracked, the skin weathered. I used to think of that as ugly, but now I see it differently. These hands saved lives. These hands pulled wounded men from burning wrecks, steadied the trembling shoulders of young soldiers, folded flags at funerals. These hands became mine. And every time I returned home, if you could even call it that, I'd pass the old house on Cedar Street and feel nothing. They didn't come to my officer commissioning. They didn't show up when I received the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. And when I made Lieutenant Colonel, I found out they had attended my sister's gallery opening that same night, just an hour's drive away. That's when I stopped hoping. I didn't stop writing. I didn't stop sending small things during the holidays, but I stopped expecting. Somewhere along the way, I learned how to carry the weight of their absence without letting it crush me. I let my uniform, my work, my integrity define me, not their silence. I built my life rank by rank, step by step, medal by medal, alone, and though they never saw me, I saw myself. That was enough. The moment I knew something was wrong felt ordinary at first. I had just returned stateside after a 7-month deployment. Afghanistan. Dust, heat, and the kind of exhaustion that settles deep in your bones. I was looking forward to the simplest things, sleeping in my own bed, making my own coffee, seeing familiar streets that didn't carry the weight of war. I remember sitting on my porch still in my uniform, peeling open the stack of mail that had piled up while I was gone. Bills, ads, the usual noise. And then I found a letter from my bank. It said my primary checking account was overdrawn. At first I thought it was a mistake. A typo maybe. I wasn't wealthy by any means, but I was careful. I didn't spend recklessly. And my military pay was consistent, steady. I logged into my account right there, phone trembling slightly in my hand. The balance glowed on the screen. Negative. Thousands of dollars gone. I blinked. Logged out. Logged back in. Same result. I felt the first trickle of unease, a low, cold current running through my veins. I checked my savings account. Empty. My small investment fund. Gone. My retirement contributions. Wiped clean. My heart pounded harder than it ever had on the battlefield. I spent the next few hours combing through statements. Page after page, line after line. Most of the charges were small, at first recurring transfers. Luxury purchases I didn't recognize. Then came the bigger withdrawals. Tens of thousands siphoned into accounts I didn't own. At some point, I realized I was gripping the edge of my desk so tightly, my knuckles had turned white. I knew I needed help. I contacted the bank's fraud department. They walked me through protocols, reassured me they'd investigate. But even as they spoke, something inside me, something I thought I'd buried, started to stir. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to let the thought form fully in my mind. But it was there. It had always been there. I knew who had done this. It wasn't strangers. It wasn't hackers. It was family. I traced the paper trail. The fraud investigator confirmed what I already suspected. The accounts the money had been funneled into. The names, the addresses. They all led back to the house I grew up in. My parents, and my sister. I sat alone in that small living room, the room I used to dream in as a child, the medals I'd earned tucked carefully inside the old wooden box by my side. My hands, those same hands that had pulled men from burning wrecks, shook as I pieced it all together. They had been stealing from me for years. Slowly, quietly, systematically. Every time I deployed. Every time I trusted them to handle my affairs while I served. They took and took and took. The total came to nearly $500,000. I should have cried. I should have raged. But all I felt was hollow. I kept hearing my mother's voice in my head. Family takes care of family. I heard my father. We only want what's best for you. I heard my sister's laughter, that familiar, condescending tone. It's not like you need it, Jenny. You're never even here. I sat there until the sky outside turned dark, the last rays of sunlight catching on the corner of the medals that no one in my family had ever cared to ask about. The betrayal wasn't just about the money, it was about the years. The letters unanswered, the calls ignored, the celebrations missed. I had built a life of service, of sacrifice, of loyalty, and they had gutted it from the inside out without blinking. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not vengeance. Something colder, calmer, sharper. I was going to take back what was mine, but not in the way they'd expect. I confronted them 3 days later. I drove to the house where I grew up, the same white brick home with the blue shutters, the manicured lawn, the flower beds my mother used to fuss over. Nothing had changed on the outside, but I wasn't the same person walking through that door. They were sitting in the living room when I arrived. My father reading the paper, my mother sipping tea from her favorite porcelain cup. My sister legs crossed on the leather sofa, scrolling through her phone without a care in the world. They looked up when I entered, surprised but not alarmed. "Jenny," my mother said, setting her cup down. "We didn't expect you." I stood in the center of the room, hands steady at my sides. "I know. I didn't sit. I didn't smile. I told them everything. The missing money, the transfers, the false authorizations. I laid it all out step by step, voice calm, measured, military sharp. For a moment there was silence, then laughter. Actual laughter. My sister smirked first. "Oh, come on. Don't be so dramatic." My father shook his head, the corners of his mouth twitching. "We thought you knew what I asked," my voice flat. "That we were helping," my mother cut in, her tone soft, condescending. "You're always away, Jenny. You don't have time to manage money. You don't understand these things. It's not your world." I felt the words hit me like cold steel. Not your world. "We weren't stealing," my father added, waving his hand as if brushing away a harmless misunderstanding. "We were safeguarding, keeping it in the family. You wouldn't know what to do with that kind of money anyway." I stared at them, at the faces that used to tuck me in at night, at the hands that once held mine to cross the street. "You think I can lead combat missions," I said quietly, "but you don't think I can manage a bank account." My sister gave a small laugh. "Please? You wear boots for a living. You're not exactly financial material." There it was. The truth. The rotting core of everything I had felt my whole life. No matter what I achieved, no matter how high I climbed in their eyes, I would always be the girl who didn't belong. The one who didn't measure up. The one they could take from without shame, without guilt, without even recognizing it as theft. I felt the weight of every unsent postcard, every unopened letter, every missed holiday. It all pressed down on my ribs, but I didn't let it break me. Instead, I breathed in. Steady, controlled. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I asked, my voice like glass. "Don't be silly," my mother said, shaking her head gently, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "It's family, Jennifer. Family doesn't need permission. Family doesn't need permission," I repeated under my breath. My father set down his paper. "Look, Jenny, you don't understand money. You never have. We were helping. Your sister's investments are solid now. It benefits all of us." That was the moment. That was the sentence that sealed it. "You don't understand money." A lifetime of erasure distilled into 5 words. I nodded slowly. No anger, no outburst. "Thank you," I said softly, "for clarifying." They smiled, thinking the conversation was over, that they'd won, that I would swallow this like I had swallowed every slight, every dismissal, every betrayal before. They didn't know they had just made the last mistake they'd ever get to make with me. I left without another word, and I never looked back. The strangest thing about betrayal is how quiet it is. It doesn't crash down like an explosion. It doesn't slice like a blade. It settles, slowly, softly, like cold water filling your lungs one breath at a time. I've been wounded before. I've faced ambushes, IEDs, gunfire in the dark. I felt the sting of shrapnel, the searing pain of fractured bone. But nothing has ever burned the way that betrayal burned. And the worst part, it wasn't sudden. It had been happening for years while I was too blind, too trusting, too desperate to believe they still loved me. I spent that night sitting in my small living room, hands resting on my knees, staring at the wall in absolute silence. The house was still. The only sound was the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. But inside me, everything was screaming. How do you come back from something like that? I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had saved lives, signed orders, steadied rifles in the worst conditions imaginable. Hands calloused from hard work and harder choices. And yet, to the people who should have known me best, those hands would always be the hands of a child, a failure, a tool to be used. The weight of it pressed down on me, heavier than any pack I'd ever carried. I thought about the letters I'd written from combat zones, the birthday cards, the small gifts. I thought about the quiet hours in foreign lands when I wondered if they missed me, if they worried, if they were proud. They weren't. They never had been. And that truth, once it rooted itself, refused to let go. I could have walked away. I could have let it slide, chalked it up to one more scar among many. But something inside me, something deeper than pride, wouldn't allow it. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about dignity, about not letting them write the ending to a story that wasn't theirs to tell. That night, I made a decision. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of clarity. I wasn't going to fight them in the way they expected. I wasn't going to shout, to plead, to beg for something they never intended to give. I was going to take back what was mine. Strategically, methodically, without apology. I pulled out an old leather notebook I'd kept since my early deployments. I opened it to a blank page, and I began to write names, dates, bank account numbers, wire transfers. I listed everything I knew, everything I had seen, every breadcrumb they'd left behind without realizing someone might actually follow. I didn't cry, I didn't break. Instead, I did what I had been trained to do: assess, plan, execute. I made phone calls the next morning to a financial crimes investigator, to a lawyer I trusted from my time working alongside military legal teams. I wasn't naive enough to think this would be easy. They had covered their tracks well, but they had underestimated me. They always had. I sat back after the last call, exhaled slowly, and for the first time in days, I felt something close to calm. Not peace, not yet, but purpose. I wasn't going to let them write me out of my own life. I wasn't going to be the silent daughter, the forgotten soldier, the woman who let betrayal define her. This time I would define myself, on my own terms, and they wouldn't see it coming. The first thing I did was call in reinforcements. Not the kind I was used to. No rifles, no battle gear. This war would be fought with paper precision and quiet strategy. I reached out to an old contact from my time in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, JAG, for short. Her name was Natalie Ruiz, a brilliant attorney who had once helped me navigate a legal mess during a deployment in Kuwait. She was sharp, methodical, and most importantly, she had no patience for injustice. When I told her what happened, she didn't gasp. She didn't even blink. She just said, "We're going to fix this." Next came the forensic accountant, a man named Charles Yates, former military himself, now working in white-collar crime investigations. He had the kind of mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos. Within minutes of me handing over the files, he was already connecting dots I hadn't even noticed. We met in a small downtown office, sterile, cold, filled with the soft hum of printers and the clatter of keyboards. I remember sitting across from them, the thin manila folders between us, the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. My hands were steady on the table. "This wasn't sloppy," Charles said, after skimming through the first stack. "Whoever did this knew just enough to be dangerous." They spread the transfers across multiple accounts, small amounts first, then larger ones as they got confident. I nodded. "I know who did it. My parents, my sister." Natalie glanced up from her notes. "Do you want criminal charges?" I paused. The old version of me, the one still desperate for their love, would have hesitated. But that person was gone. "I want the truth on paper," I said finally. "I want every dollar traced, every signature exposed. And then, I want what's mine. No emotion, no fire, just fact." We spent hours combing through the evidence: bank statements, wire transfers, legal documents forged with my name, even utility bills linked to properties I didn't know they owned, houses, vacation rentals, investments, all funded by the money they siphoned from me while I was halfway across the world fighting for freedoms they never even respected. There was a numbness to the process, a clinical detachment I'd learned in the field. When you clear a room, when you make life and death choices in seconds, you don't let your emotions drive you. You let the facts speak. This was no different. By the end of the second day, we had over 200 pages of documented fraud. I stared at the stack, hands resting on the table's edge, fingers brushing the edge of a medal I still wore sometimes beneath my jacket. Not because it mattered to them, but because it mattered to me. "They'll deny it," Natalie warned. "They'll spin it. Say you're unstable or vindictive. I know. Are you prepared for that?" I met her eyes without flinching. "I've been preparing for this my entire life." She smiled, then just slightly. "Good. Because once we file, there's no going back." I exhaled slowly. That's the point. I left the office that night with the first piece of my life rebuilt. Just one brick. But it was mine. And I wasn't going to let it fall again. Sometimes the answers you're looking for have been with you all along. It was Natalie who suggested it. We were reviewing the financial records late one evening when she looked up from her laptop and said, "Has anyone ever mentioned a will your grandfather's estate? Was it formally processed?" The question stopped me cold. I hadn't thought about it, not once. The funeral, the aftermath. The way I'd been excluded, it had all felt so deliberate, so suffocating, that I never asked the one question that mattered. What did my grandfather want? I knew one thing for certain: he had loved me. In his quiet, understated way, he had always been the only one in the family who truly saw me. The memory came back sharp, clear, as if no time had passed. I was 7 years old, sitting on the back porch of his house, struggling to tie the laces on a pair of worn military boots he'd let me wear. My hands were small, clumsy. I kept getting the loops wrong. He knelt beside me, patient, gentle, and guided my fingers until the knot held. "Try again," he said softly. "Because one day you'll have to do it alone." I never forgot that. He was the first person who told me I was strong. The first person who made me believe I could be more than what my parents saw. I spent the next morning digging through old files, dusty drawers, forgotten cabinets in the small house he had left behind. My hands trembled once, just once, when I found the faded green folder buried in the back of his desk, tucked beneath layers of forgotten paperwork. The will, the original, signed, notarized, with my name printed in steady, careful handwriting. He had left everything to me, not to my parents, not to my sister, to me. I sat on the floor cross-legged like a child, the paper trembling between my fingers. I could still hear his voice in my mind, the calm way he spoke, the way he always called me kiddo when no one else did, the way he once told me half-whispered in the dim light of the porch. The family name isn't always worth carrying. Sometimes you carry yourself instead. I traced my thumb over the signature at the bottom of the page. He'd known. Somehow, even before the rift, even before the theft, he had known who they were. And he had tried quietly, without confrontation, to protect me. I exhaled slowly, folding the will carefully and placing it into a protective sleeve. I didn't cry. There was no breakdown, no cinematic rush of emotion. Just a steady calm that settled deep in my bones. The knot he had taught me to tie years ago still held. I made copies that afternoon. Legal, certified, bulletproof. The game had changed. And this time I wasn't playing defense. By the time the will was in my hands, the next phase was already forming in my mind. War teaches you one truth above all: no battle is ever won by accident. It's preparation, precision, timing. I spent the next several weeks in quiet motion, every step measured, every decision calculated. I met with Natalie twice more. We pored over the documents line by line, built a legal framework so airtight, even the slipperiest hands couldn't wriggle free. The fraud, the forged authorizations, the breach of fiduciary duty, the mishandling of estate assets. Every angle was covered. But I knew paperwork alone wouldn't be enough. I reached out to people I hadn't spoken to in years, Marines I had served alongside, men and women who knew me not by my last name, but by the weight I carried in the field. Brothers and sisters forged by dirt fire and shared silence. I wasn't asking for favors. I didn't need them to fight for me. I just needed witnesses. People who could speak not to what I had lost, but to who I was. Some responded immediately. Others took a few days. But one by one they came. Emails, phone calls, letters written in careful block print, stories of battles survived, lives saved, kindnesses offered when no one else had stepped forward. They weren't grand gestures. They were truths. Quiet, solid truths. It wasn't for the court. It wasn't for my family. It was for me. To remind myself that who I was, the life I'd built, wasn't theirs to define or destroy. I remember standing outside the courthouse on one of those early mornings, documents in hand, when I caught the eye of an older man walking his dog. He looked at my uniform, at the ribbons on my chest, and gave me the smallest nod. Recognition, respect. It was a simple thing, but it caught me off guard, because for most of my life that look, one of quiet regard, had never come from the people who were supposed to give it freely. That morning, I walked into the county clerk's office and filed the first set of motions. The clerk barely glanced at me, her eyes glazed with routine. Another stack of paper, another name on a docket. To her it meant nothing, but to me it was everything. I caught reflections of myself in windows as I passed clean lines of the uniform polished shoes, the weight of my own steadiness. And I wondered if the people on the street, the ones sipping coffee and scrolling through their phones, could sense the war happening beneath the surface. They couldn't, of course. To them, I was just another face. But I knew better. There's a kind of power that comes from standing still while the world spins around you. From knowing that this time you're not the one being moved, you're the one moving the pieces. I tightened the knot of my coat, squared my shoulders, and took the next step forward. The game was in motion, and I wasn't stopping until I reached the end. The night before the funeral, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the city lights casting long shadows across the ceiling, my hands resting on my chest, as if holding something fragile. My eyes were open, but my mind was somewhere else, drifting back to the last time I saw my grandfather alive. It wasn't a grand moment, no dramatic farewell, just an ordinary afternoon sitting together on his back porch, watching the leaves scatter in the wind. He was older then slower. His hands, once so steady, trembled slightly as he lifted his tea. But his eyes were sharp as ever. Still fighting the good fight, kiddo, he asked, the corner of his mouth lifting. Always, I smiled. We didn't speak much that day. We never needed to. Some people fill silence with words. He taught me there was strength in letting the quiet settle. When I rose to leave, he gripped my wrist gently, his fingers thin but insistent. Don't let them tell you who you are, he murmured. Not ever. I didn't realize it then, but that was goodbye. That memory played over and over in my mind as I lay in the dark. But it wasn't the only thing haunting me. The dreams came sharp and uninvited. Twisted images of my parents, my sister faces, warped in laughter that never reached their eyes. I dreamed of sitting at that same family dinner table, only this time the plates were empty. The glasses cracked, and no one looked at me. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. I reached for the metal on my chest, but it melted in my hands, turning to ash. I woke, breathless, heart pounding. The clock read 3:17 a.m. I sat up, ran my palms over my face, grounding myself in the present. In reality. Because the truth was clear, they had never seen me. Not as I was, not as I had become. To them, I would always be the girl who didn't belong, the one who made the wrong choices, the one they could dismiss, ignore, erase. But to him, my grandfather, I had been something different. He had seen me, even when I didn't yet see myself. I rose from bed, the cool air brushing against my skin, and crossed to the small wooden box where I kept the will. I lifted it carefully, fingertips brushing the embossed lettering. It wasn't just paper, it was proof. Proof that someone at least once had believed in me without conditions. I pressed my palm flat against the lid, breathing deep. I could almost hear his voice again, steady, low, the way he used to hum old war songs under his breath, when he thought no one was listening. I stood there for a long time, letting the silence hold me. The funeral would come, the confrontation, the exposure. But tonight it was just me, and the man who'd taught me to tie my first boots. And that somehow was enough. The morning of the funeral was gray and cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones not from the wind, but from the weight of what's coming. I stood across the street from the church, dressed in full uniform. My medals, my ribbons, every scar I carried, visible and invisible, worn without apology. They saw me before I stepped foot on the church grounds. My mother's face paled first. My father stiffened, his hands buried in his coat pockets. My sister tilted her head, that same smirk she wore since childhood etched across her lips. They were already whispering. I could read their mouths without hearing the words. What is she doing here? I took one breath, then another, and then came the sound. Boots. 12 pairs of polished black shoes striking the pavement in perfect unison. The air shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. 12 Marines dressed in ceremonial blues approached in tight formation. At their lead, General Marshall, 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders, silver hair sharp against the dark wool of his uniform. They marched past the murmuring guests, past the confused faces, until they reached me. And then with crisp, deliberate precision, they halted. General Marshall removed his cover, held it to his chest, and saluted. General J. Maddox, ma'am, he said, voice steady enough to cut glass. We are here to honor both the life of your grandfather and the service you continue to give this nation. The silence was absolute. I returned the salute, my palm cutting the air with practiced grace. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to explain. They already knew. The shock on my parents' faces was palpable. My mother's mouth parted slightly, her eyes darting between me and the line of Marines as if searching for an exit. My father's jaw clenched. My sister, for the first time, no smirk, just stunned disbelief. And then Natalie stepped forward. Calm, professional. She held a thick envelope in her gloved hands, her heels clicking against the stone steps as she addressed the small gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying without strain. I've been asked to read a statement on behalf of the late Mr. Harold Maddox. She opened the envelope, and the truth, quiet, undeniable, unfolded. The original will, signed, witnessed, legally binding. Every detail was read aloud. My name the sole beneficiary. My grandfather's words preserved in legal ink, gratitude for a life of service, recognition for sacrifices unseen. I stood still as the murmurs began. Someone gasped softly. A cousin shook his head in disbelief. An old neighbor whispered, I had no idea. I didn't move. My parents were frozen. My mother's eyes filled with something between panic and humiliation. My father's fist tightened at his sides. My sister's face had drained of all color, and still nothing from me. No triumph, no gloating, only silence. The 12 Marines remained in formation, their discipline unbroken. General Marshall gave me a small nod, a quiet gesture of respect, and then returned to position. The Dichuk, my grandfather's final word, was left in my care. In the span of 10 minutes, everything they had built, the lies, the theft, the facade, crumbled at their feet. I exhaled softly. The war was not over yet, but the tide had shifted, and I wasn't walking away this time. For a long moment, no one moved. The air felt frozen thick with the weight of exposed truth. My parents stood on the church steps, perfectly still, their faces drained of all color. My mother clutched her handbag so tightly her knuckles whitened. My father's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darting as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. My sister, always the one with the perfect smile, had gone completely silent. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide, with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just shock. It was fear. Recognition, maybe, that the narrative they had spent a lifetime building had unraveled in a matter of minutes. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The will, read aloud for everyone to hear, spoke louder than any accusation I could have made. The Marines standing in perfect formation behind me made it impossible to dismiss or rewrite. I stood still, hands at my sides, my uniform pressed, my shoes shining. I kept my breath steady, my face calm. Years of training had taught me how to control my body under pressure. This wasn't a battlefield, but the discipline was the same, and they were undone. I watched the people around us, neighbors, distant relatives, old friends, shift uncomfortably. Some looked away. Some glanced at me with something like respect. Others with quiet embarrassment, not for me, but for them. For the family that had been caught with its mask torn off. There's a particular kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from exposure. From the complete and total collapse of a lie that has held for too long. This was that silence. My mother opened her mouth once, then closed it. My father's gaze never quite met mine. My sister took a small step backward without realizing she was moving. No one came to their defense. No one offered them comfort. I could have said something then. I could have thrown every insult they ever hurled at me back in their faces. I could have demanded an apology, could have let the bitterness spill out like venom. But I didn't, because I didn't need it. The truth had already done what words never could. I felt the weight of the moment settle deep in my bones. Not the rush of victory, not the heat of revenge, but something steadier, stronger. A quiet reclamation of space they had tried to steal from me for decades. And for the first time, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel until that exact second. I was free. Free of the need to prove. Free of the need to be seen by people who had never really looked. Free of the hollow ache that came from chasing something that was never mine to begin with. I straightened my shoulders, exhaled softly, and gave the smallest nod, more to myself than to anyone else. The Marines held their line behind me. The crowd shifted, whispered, and then one by one began to move. The funeral would go on. The ceremony would proceed, but the real story had already been written. I turned without fanfare and stepped back. The war was over, and I had won it without lifting a single weapon. The news spread faster than I ever anticipated. I didn't tell anyone beyond the necessary legal channels. I didn't post about it. I didn't make a single public statement. But somehow, because stories like this always find their way, the fallout exploded online within days. It started with whispers on local community pages, small threads, questions, speculation. Then someone, a distant relative perhaps, shared a photo from the funeral. Me in uniform, the Marines, the salute. And just like that, the world picked up the pieces and started stitching together its own version of the truth. I watched it unfold quietly from the sidelines. The comments came in waves. Some defended my parents. They're her family. She should have handled this privately. She's military, probably controlling, probably cold. Maybe she deserved to be left out. Others, more than I expected, spoke up for me. She served her country. They stole from her. What kind of parents do that? Imagine raising a daughter who becomes a general and still not being proud. The narratives twisted, tangled. Strangers projected their own family wounds onto my story. Some saw me as the villain, others the victim. A few painted me as some ice-hearted tactician, too rigid, too strong, too unyielding. And that was when I realized the truth about perception. People don't see you as you are. They see you through the lens of their own pain, their own regrets, their own loyalties. It didn't matter that they didn't know the quiet dinners where I was invisible, the birthdays missed, the letters unanswered. It didn't matter that they hadn't seen the bruises that didn't leave marks. They were going to write their own versions anyway. At first I thought about responding, about setting the record straight. But then I stopped myself. Because the people who mattered already knew. The friends who stood by me, the Marines who had saluted me without hesitation. The memory of my grandfather's quiet faith in me. And me. I knew who I was. I let the noise roll on untouched, comment after comment, opinion after opinion. One post in particular stayed with me. A woman I'd never met wrote, "Sometimes family isn't who you're born to. It's who stands with you when the storm comes." I read it twice, and for the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to exhale. The world would keep talking. Let them. I wasn't here to be understood by everyone. I was here to be true to myself. And that finally was enough. The days after the funeral were the quietest I can remember. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, just stillness. The kind of stillness that settles into your bones when the noise dies down and you're left alone with the weight of what's been done. I kept moving through the motions, morning runs, training sessions, the small rituals that made up the scaffolding of my life. But inside something felt different, hollow in places I hadn't expected. The truth is, I thought winning would feel different. I thought reclaiming what was mine, exposing them, taking back my name, would somehow heal the wound they carved into me years ago. I thought the recognition, the justice, the sheer undeniability of it all would fill the emptiness they left behind. It didn't. Because the thing no one tells you about betrayal is this: even when you win, you still lose something. I found myself thinking late into the night, sitting alone in the small kitchen, the old wooden box with my medals on the table, the will resting beside it. I would run my fingers over the raised edges of the ribbons, tracing their lines, like they might hold an answer I hadn't yet seen. But no matter how many times I asked myself the same question, does reclaiming your life erase the hurt of being cast aside? The answer remained the same. No, it doesn't. Some wounds don't heal by victory. They heal by acceptance, by letting go of the need to make the past different than it was. I could have retaliated, publicly, legally. I could have dragged their names through the mud, destroyed what little standing they had left in that carefully constructed social circle they clung to. But I chose not to. Not because I forgave them. Not because I felt some higher moral obligation, but because it wasn't who I wanted to be. I didn't need to become the monster they made me out to be. I didn't need to let the bitterness take root. I chose silence not as surrender, but as power. I would live well. I would serve. I would build. I would create something they couldn't touch. And if that meant standing alone, so be it. I wasn't the girl at the dinner table anymore, waiting to be seen. I was the woman who had seen herself, who had fought, endured, and survived. And that was enough. The loneliness was real. The ache was real. But so was the strength. So was the freedom. I looked out the window that night, the city lights glowing softly in the distance, and whispered to no one at all, "They don't get to define me. Not now. Not ever again." In the months that followed, I built something I hadn't expected. It wasn't grand. It wasn't public. There were no cameras, no speeches, no headlines. It started small, just a folding table under a battered awning in a quiet corner of the city. A coffee urn, a stack of fresh rolls, a few crates of fruit, and one simple wooden sign carved by hand, "The Quiet Table." I used part of my inheritance, the portion that hadn't gone to legal fees, to create something my grandfather would have been proud of. A breakfast service for homeless veterans, no questions asked, no judgment, just a warm meal and a safe place to sit for a while. The first morning, I wasn't sure anyone would come, but by sunrise, 2 men and a woman had already gathered near the table. They didn't ask who I was. They didn't care about the uniform or the medals or the name. They just nodded quietly when I poured the coffee, thanked me softly when I handed them plates. That was all I needed. I kept showing up. Every morning, sometimes 5 people, sometimes 15, rain or shine. My hands, those same hands that had once gripped rifles, now handed out warm bread, peeled oranges, poured cups of tea. And in those moments, something in me began to heal. Because the truth is, the small things matter. The quiet things. The unseen kindnesses that don't make the news, that no one claps for. I had spent so many years chasing the idea that value came from recognition, from being seen, from proving something to people who had never looked in the first place. Here, none of that mattered. Here it was enough to simply serve. Some days the same faces returned. Faces worn by life, by war, by loss. Men and women who understood the silence I carried because they carried it too. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There's a language in quiet gestures, the passing of a plate, the refill of a cup that speaks louder than words ever could. I carved time each week to sit with them, not as General Maddox, but as Jennifer. Just Jennifer. The woman who knew what it meant to feel invisible. The soldier who knew what it meant to come home to emptiness. The quiet table grew slowly. Volunteers joined. Donations came. We added more chairs, more shade, more hands to serve. But I never missed a morning. Because this wasn't about numbers. It was about dignity. One morning, as the sun broke across the rooftops, an older man, Vietnam veteran, by the look of his worn jacket, nodded at me and said, "You show up. That's what matters." I smiled then. A real smile. The kind that comes from someplace deeper than pride. The kind that says, "I'm still here. I still matter. And I choose to rise." And for the first time in years, I felt whole. Not because they saw me, but because I finally saw myself. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. No warning, no special delivery. Just a plain white envelope tucked between utility bills and grocery flyers, the kind of mail you almost throw away without a second glance. But the handwriting stopped me. It was his. I sat at the kitchen table, the morning light stretching thin across the floor, and turned the envelope over in my hands. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I wanted to open it. Part of me, the old part, the child who still waited for approval that would never come, half expected another wound. But I broke the seal anyway. The paper was plain. The handwriting shaky but familiar. Just a few short lines in ink that bled slightly at the edges. "Jennifer, I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I was wrong. About everything. About you. I see that now. I hope wherever life takes you, you find peace. Your father." That was it. No grand explanation. No long-winded excuses. Just those few words, sparse and brittle like the man himself. I read it twice, then a third time, and something unexpected happened. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt release. It wasn't forgiveness. I wasn't sure I was capable of that, not fully. Some cuts go too deep, some fractures never set right. But it was enough. Enough to close the door without slamming it. Enough to finally let the weight of his voice, the criticism, the dismissal, the endless quiet disapproval slip off my shoulders. I set the letter down, fingers resting lightly on the paper. For so long, I had believed that closure came from confrontation, from forcing people to admit their wrongs to apologize to see me. But sometimes closure is something you give yourself. I didn't need him to rewrite the past. I didn't need him to fix what had already been broken. I just needed to know that for one brief moment he had seen the truth, even if too late. That was enough. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, not to revisit, not to cling to, but to mark the place where the story ended. That night I walked to the quiet table alone. The air was crisp, the stars sharp above the city skyline. I sat for a while after the volunteers had packed up, listening to the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. And I thought about how strange life is. How sometimes the people who should have loved you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. How sometimes the apology doesn't change anything, but it still matters. I pressed my palms flat against the wooden table, felt the worn grain beneath my fingertips. I wasn't the person they had tried to shape. I wasn't the failure they named. I was something else. Someone I built piece by piece, scar by scar, breath by breath. And I was still standing. The first anniversary of the quiet table came quietly, just the way I had hoped. No cameras, no ceremony. Just me, the familiar faces who showed up every morning, and the city waking up around us. The 12 Marines were there too, not in uniform, not as soldiers, but as people. Friends. They arrived with fresh bread coffee, and that same steady presence they had always brought to the battlefield. We sat together on the worn wooden benches, passing stories back and forth like old coins. Some were funny, some were hard. None of us spoke about rank or medals or the ghosts we carried. It wasn't about that here. It was about being seen, just as we were. At one point, someone asked if I missed the fight. The uniform, the noise of it all. I shook my head. No, I said softly. Some battles are meant to end. Some wars aren't worth fighting forever. They nodded. They understood. We stayed until the sun climbed high, laughter and silence blending into something that felt whole. And in that moment, I realized something simple but profound. Family isn't always the people you come from. Sometimes family is the people who choose you. The ones who stay. The ones who see you for who you really are, not who they expect you to be. I looked around the table at the hands passing coffee, the eyes that had seen too much but still softened in kindness, and I felt it settle deep inside me. I had lost something once, but I had found something better. Before we say goodbye, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning, the kind where the world feels still and you're wrapped in the comfort of a warm cup of coffee? Or maybe it's a late night, and stories like this keep you company when the rest of the world is asleep. Wherever you are, let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm grateful for each of you who spends these moments here with me. And if this story touched your heart, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to join a community that still believes in kindness, in healing, in second chances. Thank you for giving me a piece of your time today. Thank you for letting me share this story. Wherever you are in the world, whatever your battles look like, I hope you carry this with you. I hope you remember. Sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. Sometimes it waits quietly, patiently, until you're ready to open your heart and let it in. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.